"Go ahead, Mom," my brother said with a laugh as the waiter poured champagne beside the birthday cake. "You've been dying to tell her all night." My mother smiled across the long dining table like she was about to announce something charming instead of destroying me in front of 60 people. "Evelyn deserves honesty for her 28th birthday," she said calmly, sliding a thick white envelope across the linen tablecloth toward me. My father stared into his bourbon without touching it. My hands stopped moving the second I saw the blue laboratory logo in the corner, DNA Diagnostics Group. My stomach dropped so fast I almost knocked over my wine glass. "What is this?" I asked quietly. My mother folded her hands together. "Proof." Someone near the piano stopped talking. Even the string quartet seemed to lose rhythm for half a second. My brother Ethan leaned back in his chair and muttered, "Jesus," under his breath like he already knew what was inside. I looked around the room at my parents' friends, business partners, country club couples in black tuxedos and silk dresses, pretending not to stare directly at me. Then my mother said the sentence that split my life clean in half. "Richard is not your biological father. If this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, I'd love for you to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I always read them later at night when the house is quiet. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 28 years old. And this was the birthday dinner that finally explained why my family spent my entire life treating me like someone they regretted keeping. It started 3 weeks earlier with a text message from my mother that simply read, "Please wear something appropriate this year. Your father invited important people." That was how Margaret Carter communicated affection, through warnings, through corrections, through reminders that I was always one wrong move away from embarrassing her. I was standing inside Nordstrom Rack when I got the message, holding a navy dress against myself in a fluorescent fitting room mirror while 2 teenage girls argued outside about homecoming shoes. I stared at my reflection longer than necessary. The dress was simple, elegant, conservative enough for my mother's standards. I bought it anyway. The birthday dinner was being held at the Lakeshore Club downtown, the kind of place with valet parking, marble floors, and waiters who somehow appeared the second your water glass dropped below halfway. My parents loved places like that because they loved audiences. My father Richard built a commercial real estate company from almost nothing, and my mother spent the last 25 years making sure everyone in Chicago knew it. Reputation mattered more than comfort in our family. More than honesty, too, apparently. I arrived 20 minutes early the night of the dinner because arriving late gave my mother migraines she blamed on stress and disrespect. The ballroom smelled faintly like roses and expensive perfume. Gold candles flickered against mirrored walls. A jazz trio played near the piano while servers carried trays of crab cakes through the crowd. My mother spotted me immediately from across the room. Her eyes traveled slowly over my dress, my shoes, my hair, evaluating. "At least you listened for once," she said when I reached her. "Not hello, not happy birthday." I kissed her cheek anyway, because after 28 years, disappointment had become our family's native language. "Where's Dad?" I asked. "Talking to investors." She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist. "And please tonight, Evelyn, don't start one of your emotional episodes." I blinked. "I don't have emotional episodes. You cried at Thanksgiving because Ethan interrupted you twice." "Mom, he literally called me unemployed in front of everyone, because freelancing from coffee shops doesn't exactly scream stability." She smiled tightly at a passing guest before lowering her voice again. "Tonight is important for your father's company. Please don't make things difficult." There it was again. Difficult. That word followed me through childhood like a shadow. Ethan was driven. Ethan was confident. Ethan was leadership material. I was sensitive, complicated, difficult. The daughter who somehow managed to disappoint people even while sitting quietly. I spotted my father near the bar speaking with 3 men in tailored suits. He looked older lately, more tired around the eyes, but the second he noticed me, something softened briefly in his expression. "Hey kiddo," he said when I walked over. Kiddo. He only called me that when my mother wasn't close enough to hear. He kissed the side of my head quickly. "You look beautiful tonight." I smiled before I could stop myself. "Thanks, Dad." One of the men beside him asked what I did for work, and before I could answer, Ethan appeared out of nowhere with a whiskey glass in his hand. "Evelyn's still figuring life out," he said smoothly. Everyone laughed politely. My father didn't. I watched his jaw tighten for just a second before he took another sip of bourbon. Tiny moments like that used to confuse me when I was younger. The strange guilt in his eyes whenever someone humiliated me. The way he sometimes defended me softly when my mother wasn't around. The way family photos always felt slightly staged whenever I stood between them. That night, standing under crystal chandeliers while strangers smiled at me with expensive teeth, I started noticing something else too. People kept looking at my mother nervously, like they knew she was planning something. Then halfway through dinner, after the salads were cleared and the birthday cake was rolled beside the stage, my mother stood slowly and tapped her champagne glass with a silver spoon. "Before dessert," she announced, "there's something our family needs to address." My father immediately went still beside me, completely still, and for the first time in my life, I realized he looked afraid. The silence after my mother spoke felt thick enough to touch. I looked at my father first because some part of me still expected him to laugh awkwardly and say this had all been some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, he kept staring at the amber liquid in his glass like it contained instructions for how to survive the next few minutes. My mother reached for the envelope beside her plate with perfectly manicured fingers and slid out several papers. "I think honesty is healthier than pretending," she said smoothly. The people around us shifted in their chairs. Silverware stopped clinking. Across the ballroom, one of the waiters froze beside the dessert cart holding tiny lemon tarts. Nobody was touching anymore. "Margaret," my father said quietly. Just her name, a warning wrapped in exhaustion. But she ignored him. "Evelyn has always been emotional," she continued, "sensitive, difficult to parent at times, and now we finally understand why." My throat tightened so hard I could barely swallow. Ethan would not look at me. He just rubbed his thumb along the rim of his whiskey glass over and over. I realized then that he had known, maybe for weeks, maybe longer. And somehow that betrayal hurt almost more than my mother's words, because Ethan used to be my safe place once. When we were kids, before our family learned how to organize love like a ranking system, he used to sneak me cookies from the kitchen after Mom put me to bed early for crying too much. I remembered sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor at 9 years old while he whispered, "You care too much about what she thinks." I had laughed through tears and asked, "How do you stop?" He shrugged. "I do not think she likes anybody enough to break me." Back then I thought he was joking. By middle school, the difference between us became impossible to ignore. Ethan got driving lessons at 14 on my father's boat near Lake Geneva, while I stayed home helping my mother polish serving trays before a charity dinner. Ethan got season tickets to Cubs games with Dad. I got etiquette books wrapped as Christmas presents. One year on my 16th birthday, my father gave Ethan a used BMW because he needed reliable transportation for leadership programs. My gift was a pearl bracelet my mother picked out herself because, according to her, young women should learn elegance before independence. I still remember smiling and thanking them while Ethan stood there awkwardly holding car keys he clearly knew should not have been his. Small moments, tiny cuts. That was how my family operated. Never cruel enough to explain to outsiders, just enough to make you question your own memory. At 17, I got accepted into Northwestern's journalism program with a partial scholarship. I cried in the kitchen, holding the letter while my guidance counselor left a congratulatory voicemail on the house phone. My father hugged me so tightly I could smell cedarwood cologne on his jacket for hours afterward. "That is my girl," he whispered into my hair. For one night, I felt chosen. Then my mother walked into the kitchen, read the acceptance letter, and asked, "Journalism? What exactly do you plan on doing with that?" The air changed immediately. Dad stepped back. "It is a good school," he said carefully. "It is not practical," my mother replied. She looked directly at me. "You are not Ethan, sweetheart. You need stability." Ethan eventually joined my father's company after business school. Corner office by 27, golf weekends with investors. My mother framed every magazine mention, like he had cured cancer. Meanwhile, I bounced between freelance writing jobs, marketing contracts, and editing work while trying to build something that actually felt like mine. Every family dinner somehow turned into an update on Ethan's future, while my life was discussed like a temporary inconvenience. "Still freelancing?" my mother would ask in front of guests. "You know healthcare companies are always hiring assistants," or she would smile tightly and say, "Evelyn is still finding herself, finding myself." Like I had been wandering barefoot through a forest for 10 years instead of working 70-hour weeks trying to survive Chicago rent prices, while pretending my family's disappointment did not hollow me out from the inside. The worst part was, my father always looked guilty afterward, never angry enough to stop her, just guilty, like he owed me something he could never explain. And now, standing inside that ballroom with crystal chandeliers reflecting off untouched champagne glasses, I finally understood why. My mother lifted one of the DNA papers gently like she was presenting evidence in court. "I did not want this secret following us forever," she said, "especially not with Richard planning to restructure family trusts next year." There it was. The real reason. Money. Inheritance. Bloodlines. Around us, whispers started spreading across the room like smoke. One woman near the bar leaned toward another and murmured, "Can you imagine finding out at a birthday dinner?" I wanted to disappear. My skin felt too tight, too visible. My father finally set his bourbon down with a soft clink against the table. "That is enough," he said quietly. But my mother's expression sharpened immediately. "No," she snapped. Enough was 28 years ago. The room went still again, and then she said something that made the back of my neck turn cold. "You deserve to know why your father could never fully connect with you." My father closed his eyes like those words physically hurt him. And suddenly I realized there was another secret in this family. Something older, something nobody at that table was prepared for me to uncover. My mother's words hung over the ballroom like smoke after a fire. Nobody reached for their drinks anymore. Even the jazz trio near the piano had gone silent. I looked at my father, waiting for him to deny what she said, to finally stand up for me in a way he never had before, but he just sat there with both hands wrapped around his glass like it was the only thing keeping him steady. "Margaret," he said again, lower this time, tired, "do not do this here." "Where else would honesty belong?" she replied sharply. Then she turned back toward the guests with that polished smile she used at charity galas and board dinners. "I spent 28 years protecting this family's reputation." The word reputation landed harder than anything else. Not daughter, not marriage. Reputation. Like I had always been some loose thread she spent years trying to tuck out of sight. My chest felt hollow suddenly. I looked around the room at faces I had known since childhood. Men who shook my hand at Christmas parties. Women who used to compliment my dresses at Easter brunches. They were all staring now with that same expression people wear when they slow down beside a car accident. Curious. Relieved it is not happening to them. Ethan finally stood up beside me. "Mom," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "This is getting ugly." "It was ugly 28 years ago," she snapped. "I am simply done pretending." Ethan looked at me then, and for the first time all night, I saw actual guilt in his eyes. Real guilt. Not awkwardness. Not discomfort. "Eve," he said quietly, "I did not know she was going to do this tonight." I laughed once under my breath, because that was somehow worse. He knew something. Just not this version of it. Typical Carter family behavior. Everybody holding different pieces of the truth like separate business assets. My father suddenly pushed his chair back hard enough that several guests jumped. "Enough," he said firmly. "We are done." But my mother was already reaching into her purse again. "No," she said, "she deserves context." Context. Like my life was a corporate presentation, she needed to clarify with additional slides. I should have walked out then. I think about that sometimes. I should have grabbed my coat and left before things got worse. But something inside me had shifted the second my father looked afraid. Because fear did not make sense unless there was more he had never told me. And deep down, I think I had spent my entire life waiting for someone to finally explain why I always felt slightly misplaced inside my own family. My mind drifted suddenly to 2 years earlier, when things first started changing between my mother and me, in a way I could not fully understand at the time. It was after an article I wrote unexpectedly went viral online. A long-form piece about burnout culture and corporate image obsession. I wrote it sitting in a coffee shop on Clark Street after getting rejected for another full-time marketing position. I almost did not publish it because I was tired of hearing my mother call my writing internet hobbies. But 3 days later, the article exploded. Millions of views, interviews, podcast invitations. A New York media company offered me a contributor contract worth more money than I had ever made in my life. I still remember standing in my tiny apartment kitchen staring at the email while pasta boiled over on the stove. I called my father first, He answered on the second ring. "Kiddo," he said. "Dad," I whispered. "I think something good finally happened." He laughed immediately. Proud, warm. "Tell me everything." For 20 minutes he listened while I paced barefoot across my apartment, talking too fast and crying halfway through sentences. At the end, he said quietly, "I always knew you had something special in you. Nobody had ever said that to me before. Not like that. I drove to my parents' house that weekend, thinking maybe things would finally change. Maybe success would make my mother see me differently. But the second I walked into the kitchen, she glanced up from arranging flowers and said, 'Your father told me about your little article.' Little article. Even then. 'It is not little, Mom,' I replied carefully. 'The company wants to fly me to New York next month.'" She continued trimming flower stems without looking at me. "Internet attention disappears fast, Evelyn. Do not build your identity around temporary praise." Ethan walked in halfway through the conversation, holding a gym bag over one shoulder. "Wait," he said, looking at me. "You got flown to New York?" "Probably coach," my mother said before I could answer. Ethan ignored her and smiled at me anyway. "That is huge, Eve." But my mother's expression stayed unreadable, cold almost. And after that weekend, strange things started happening. Family friends stopped mentioning my articles around her. Invitations I used to receive suddenly disappeared. One editor I had been networking with canceled lunch after mysteriously meeting my mother at a fundraiser. At the time, I told myself I was imagining patterns because rejection hurt less when it felt random. But now, standing inside that ballroom watching my mother clutch DNA results like ammunition, I realized something terrifying. She had not just disliked my success, she had been afraid of it. Then from across the room near the piano, I noticed an older woman watching me with an expression I could not place. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition. And the second our eyes met, she slowly stood up. The woman near the piano stood slowly, one hand resting against the polished black surface like she needed it for balance. The room changed the second people recognized her. I could actually feel it happen. Conversations stopped mid-whisper. One of the investors near the bar straightened his jacket immediately. A woman beside my mother quietly muttered, "Oh my God, that is Eleanor Vale." Even my mother's posture shifted, tiny but visible. Her shoulders tightened beneath her cream-colored dress. And for the first time that night, she looked uncertain. Eleanor Vale was in her late 60s, silver hair swept neatly behind her shoulders, posture perfectly straight despite the cane resting beside her chair. I recognized her instantly from magazine covers and charity events around Chicago. The Vale family practically built half the city's museums, hospitals, and financial institutions. They did not attend dinners like this unless something mattered deeply. Eleanor looked directly at me as she crossed the ballroom floor. Not at my mother, not at my father. Me. Her eyes looked glassy under the chandelier light, like she was trying very hard not to cry. "Margaret?" she said quietly once she reached our table. "What exactly are you doing?" My mother recovered quickly. She always did. "Eleanor," she replied with a tight smile, "I did not realize you and Richard still crossed paths socially." My father looked stunned, completely stunned. "You invited Eleanor?" he asked my mother. "Of course not," she answered sharply. "One of the board members brought her." Eleanor ignored both of them. She kept looking at me with this strange mixture of grief and recognition that made my skin prickle. "How old are you now?" she asked softly. 28, I answered automatically. Her eyes closed briefly, just for a second, like the number physically hurt her. "That is what I thought," she whispered. My mother stepped forward immediately. "Eleanor, I do not think this is the appropriate time." "No," Eleanor replied calmly. "I believe it finally is." The ballroom had gone completely silent again. Somewhere in the kitchen, a tray crashed loudly against tile, but nobody in the room even turned. Every eye stayed fixed on our table. My father slowly stood beside me. "Eleanor," he said, "if there is something you need to say, perhaps we should speak privately." "You already tried private 28 years ago," she answered. My father's face lost color instantly. I looked between them, confused. "Dad?" He would not look at me. That scared me more than anything else. My mother folded her arms tightly across her chest. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "The DNA results are very clear." "The DNA results are incomplete," Eleanor said. My stomach dropped again. Incomplete. Ethan looked up sharply from beside me. "What does that mean?" he asked. Eleanor reached into her handbag slowly and pulled out another envelope, thick cream paper. My mother's face changed immediately the second she saw it. Not anger, panic, real panic. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. Eleanor's expression hardened. "The same place you buried it." My pulse started hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Somebody tell me what is happening," I said, my voice finally cracking. Nobody answered right away. My father pressed a hand against the back of his chair like he suddenly needed support. Ethan looked completely lost now, eyes moving rapidly between our parents. Then Eleanor turned toward me fully and asked a question that made the entire room feel suddenly too small. "Has your mother ever told you about Street Catherine's hospital?" I frowned. "No." Eleanor nodded slowly like she expected that answer. "Of course she did not." My mother stepped forward so fast her chair scraped loudly across the marble floor. "Enough," she snapped. "You are not doing this." Eleanor looked at her calmly. "You already did this, Margaret. I am simply refusing to let her carry your lies any longer." Lies, plural. My hands started shaking under the tablecloth, tiny uncontrollable tremors. Suddenly, every strange memory from childhood started pushing to the surface all at once. My baby photos looking different from Ethan's. My mother refusing to talk about my birth stories. My father once drunkenly telling me at 16, "I should have fought harder for you," before pretending the conversation never happened the next morning. The room felt colder now, heavier. "Dad," I whispered, "what is she talking about?" He finally looked at me then, and I will never forget the guilt in his face. Not embarrassment, not discomfort. Guilt so deep, it looked permanent. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "there are things about your birth your mother and I should have told you a long time ago." My mother spun toward him instantly. "Richard, do not you dare!" But he was already staring at the envelope in Eleanor's hand, like he knew exactly what was inside. And whatever he saw there made him look like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. The ballroom no longer sounded like a birthday party. It sounded like a courtroom after someone finally admitted guilt. Nobody touched the cake. The candles had burned low enough that wax dripped onto the silver tray beneath them in uneven white lines. My mother stood frozen beside the table, one hand gripping the back of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. My father looked 20 years older than he had an hour earlier, and Eleanor Vale still held that cream-colored envelope like she had carried it for decades, waiting for this exact moment. "Richard," my mother said sharply, "say something." But he did not answer her. He looked at me instead. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "I never wanted you to find out like this." The words hit harder than the DNA results somehow, because they confirmed there really was something to find out. My throat burned. "Find out what?" I asked. My voice barely sounded like mine anymore. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. Ethan stepped between us suddenly. "Okay, no," he said, shaking his head. "Somebody needs to explain what the hell is happening because none of this makes sense." Eleanor looked toward him calmly. "Your sister was never the problem in this family." Ethan stared at her. "What does that mean?" But before she could answer, my mother grabbed her purse and stood abruptly. "This conversation is over." Chairs shifted around the ballroom as guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. One couple near the back quietly slipped toward the exit. My mother noticed immediately. Image control. Even now. "Nobody is leaving," she snapped too quickly. Then she forced a brittle smile at the room. "This is simply a private family misunderstanding." Eleanor laughed softly under her breath, not cruelly, sadly. "Margaret," she said, "you stopped being able to call this private the moment you humiliated your daughter in front of 60 people. Daughter." She said daughter with certainty, warmth even. My chest tightened unexpectedly. My mother ignored her and turned toward me instead. "Evelyn, sweetheart, please come home tomorrow and we will talk calmly." Sweetheart. She had not called me that in years. Not genuinely. The sudden softness in her voice felt rehearsed, like a politician shifting tone during a scandal. "No," I said quietly. Her expression flickered. "Excuse me? You made your decision tonight in front of everyone," I replied. "You do not get to suddenly act protective now." Around us, phones were starting to appear discreetly beneath tables, screens glowing softly in people's hands. Someone was already texting about this, probably several people. Chicago society moved fast when humiliation involved wealthy families. My father rubbed a hand over his face. "Margaret," he said tiredly. You should never have done this publicly. Publicly? She snapped. You spent 28 years lying to me too, Richard. Silence crashed down again. I stared at him. You knew? He looked shattered. Not at first. How long? He swallowed hard. Since you were 3. 3. My knees almost gave out. 3 years old. He had known almost my entire life, and still watched my mother treat me like an outsider at every holiday table, every birthday dinner, every quiet humiliation disguised as discipline. Dad, I whispered, why would you stay? His eyes filled immediately. Because I loved you. The answer should have comforted me. Instead, it hurt so badly I could barely breathe. Because if that was love, why had I spent my entire childhood feeling tolerated instead of wanted? Ethan looked physically sick now. He grabbed his phone from the table and walked several feet away before muttering, I need air. I heard him whispering harshly into the phone near the ballroom entrance a minute later. No, Julia, it is worse than that. Way worse. My mother suddenly reached for my arm, but I stepped back instinctively. That tiny movement changed something in her expression. Panic finally surfaced fully. Evelyn, she said carefully, you are overwhelmed right now. Eleanor has manipulated this situation before. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. You mean the way you manipulated hospital records? My mother went completely still. So did my father. That was the moment everything cracked open. Not shattered loudly, quietly. Like ice finally giving way under too much weight. My father closed his eyes. Dear God, he whispered. I stared at my mother. Hospital records? She looked at me desperately now. It is complicated. Then explain it. Not here. You already chose here. My voice rose for the first time all night. Heads turned immediately. The room blurred slightly at the edges from adrenaline and exhaustion. Eleanor slowly handed me the envelope. You deserve the truth, she said softly. My fingers shook as I took it. Inside were copies of old documents. Birth forms, medical notes, a faded photograph of a newborn baby wrapped in a striped hospital blanket. On the back, someone had written the name Evelyn Vale in blue ink. Vale, not Carter. My stomach dropped so hard it physically hurt. What is this? I whispered. Nobody answered immediately. My mother looked like she might collapse. My father stared at the floor. Ethan had stopped talking entirely near the entrance, frozen with his phone still against his ear, and standing in the middle of that ballroom filled with strangers pretending not to watch my life unravel, I realized something devastating. Nobody in my family had ever intended for me to know who I really was, and somehow that truth felt lonelier than finding out I did not belong there at all. I left the ballroom through the side exit because I could not survive another second of people pretending not to stare at me. The hallway outside the banquet room smelled faintly like furniture polish and cold air from the parking garage below. My heels clicked too loudly against the marble floor. Everything felt too loud suddenly. My breathing, my heartbeat. The sound of my own thoughts, trying desperately to rearrange 28 years into something that made sense. Behind me I heard my mother calling my name. Evelyn, wait. I kept walking. Evelyn, please. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. I stopped near the elevators but did not turn around immediately. When I finally faced her, she looked smaller somehow. Not physically, just diminished. Like all the control she carried so carefully had started slipping through her fingers. You humiliated me in front of everyone, I said quietly. You brought DNA results to my birthday dinner. I was trying to protect this family. I laughed once under my breath, tired, hollow. From me? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, my mother looked unsure of herself. You do not understand what happened back then, she whispered. Then explain it. Her eyes shifted away from mine instantly. Not tonight. That answer broke something in me more completely than the DNA results ever could have. Because deep down, I think I already knew the truth. If she had loved me enough, there would never have been a tonight. There would have been honesty years ago. There would have been photographs, stories, warmth. Instead, there had only been management, image control, distance carefully disguised as discipline. My father stepped into the hallway a moment later. His tie loosened now, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Ethan followed behind him looking pale and shaken. Nobody looked like family anymore. We looked like survivors standing outside a disaster nobody knew how to clean up. Kiddo, my father said softly. I flinched before I could stop myself. The pain that crossed his face afterward nearly made me apologize for it. "I need time," I whispered. He nodded immediately. "You can take all the time you need." My mother looked at him sharply. "Richard, do not encourage this." He turned toward her so slowly, it almost frightened me. "Encourage what, Margaret?" he asked quietly. "Our daughter leaving after we destroyed her in public?" Our daughter. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they just hurt. Because love that arrives too late feels strangely similar to grief. Ethan stepped closer carefully. "Eve," he said, "I swear to you I did not know about the hospital records." I looked at him for a long second. "But you knew enough to stay quiet." His face fell immediately because we both knew it was true. Silence can betray people just as deeply as lies. I rode the elevator down alone. In the mirrored walls I barely recognized myself. My mascara had smudged slightly beneath my eyes. My birthday earring suddenly felt heavy against my neck. When the elevator doors opened into the underground garage, cold November air wrapped around me instantly. I sat inside my car for nearly 20 minutes without turning the engine on. My phone would not stop vibrating. Text messages, calls, notifications. "Ethan, please answer me." "Dad, I am so sorry." "Mom, we need to discuss this privately before rumors spread." Rumors. Even now. I stared at that word until my vision blurred. Then another message appeared from a number I did not recognize. "Eleanor Vale. I got your number from your father. There are things you deserve to know. Not tonight, but soon." I did not answer. I drove home through downtown Chicago while rain streaked softly across the windshield and the city lights blurred gold against wet pavement. By the time I reached my apartment, social media had already started exploding. Someone from the ballroom leaked the story almost immediately. Carter family DNA scandal was trending locally before midnight. One blurry photo showed me standing beside the birthday cake while my mother held the envelope. I looked stunned even in low resolution. The comments underneath made my stomach turn. People speculating, inventing affairs, calling me illegitimate like I was a mistake instead of a person. Around 2 a.m, my father emailed me. Not texted, emailed. Subject line, "I should have protected you." The message itself was only 4 sentences long. "Evelyn, I loved you from the moment I held you." None of this changes that for me. I know I failed you by staying silent. I hope someday you will let me explain everything. I read it 3 times, sitting on my kitchen floor with my coat still on before quietly closing my laptop, because the hardest part was that I believed him. I believed he loved me. And somehow that made the betrayal lonelier, not smaller. Outside my apartment window, snow had started falling lightly over the city. Tiny white flakes drifting past the streetlights in complete silence. I stood there watching them for a long time, with Eleanor's unopened message glowing faintly on my phone screen beside me. And for the first time since the ballroom, I realized something else was beginning underneath all the grief. Not forgiveness, not healing. Something quieter. The feeling that somewhere buried beneath 28 years of lies, there might still be a version of my life that actually belonged to me. The first thing I did after the scandal was change my last name online. Not legally, not yet, just quietly. One Tuesday morning before sunrise, sitting at my kitchen counter in sweatpants with cold coffee beside my laptop, I opened my website settings and deleted Carter from every profile I owned. Evelyn Carter became simply Evelyn Reed, my middle name, the one my grandmother on my father's side used to call me when I was little. It felt strangely terrifying, pressing save, like stepping onto ice without knowing how deep the water was underneath. My phone still buzzed constantly for the next few weeks. Reporters, former classmates pretending concern, family friends asking for clarity. I ignored almost all of them. My mother left 2 voicemails every day, at exactly 8:00 p.m. The timing alone felt calculated. "Evelyn, this silence is not helping anyone. You are misunderstanding what happened. Please stop embarrassing the family publicly, never once. Are you okay?" My father's messages were different. Short, careful, human. "I made your favorite soup and froze some for you if you want it. The snowstorm tomorrow is supposed to be bad. Drive safely. I miss you, kiddo." Those hurt the most because they sounded real. Ethan texted less often after the first month. At first he kept trying. "Coffee? Please. Just 30 minutes. Then eventually, I do not know how to fix this. Then finally, nothing at all. Silence settled over my life slowly after that. Not dramatic silence, ordinary silence. Grocery shopping alone, folding laundry alone, watching snow pile against my apartment windows while nobody called to ask if I made it home safely. The loneliness surprised me because technically I had been lonely inside my family for years already. But there is something uniquely painful about realizing you were emotionally orphaned long before you physically walked away. I started working more because work was measurable, predictable, honest. The media company in New York expanded my contributor contract after my article series about image culture and inherited shame unexpectedly exploded online. Millions of readers, interview requests from national podcasts. One producer told me during a Zoom meeting, "People trust you because you sound like someone who survived something without becoming cruel." I muted myself after she said that because suddenly I could not speak. Every morning I walked 3 blocks to the same coffee shop near my apartment, carrying my laptop in an old canvas tote bag. The barista started making my drink before I even reached the counter. Large oat milk latte. Extra shot, no cinnamon. Small details became anchors. One rainy afternoon in March, I was finishing edits on an essay when a woman at the next table leaned toward me carefully. "I know this is strange," she said softly, "but your writing helped me leave my family." I blinked at her. She looked nervous now, twisting the cardboard sleeve around her coffee cup. "My mother spent my whole life making me feel impossible to love," she continued. "Reading your story made me realize maybe I was never the problem." I did not know what to say to that, so I just reached across the table and squeezed her hand once. After she left, I sat there staring at my screen for nearly 10 minutes without typing a word. Because for the first time since the ballroom, the pain had done something besides destroy me. It had connected me to people. Eleanor and I began meeting every other Sunday after that, usually quiet lunches in small restaurants far enough from downtown that nobody recognized her immediately. She never pushed too hard, never flooded me with explanations before I was ready. Sometimes we barely talked about the past at all. We discussed books, architecture, why Chicago winters made everyone walk faster. But little truths kept surfacing naturally between conversations. "You laugh like your grandmother," she told me once while stirring tea absent-mindedly. Another time, she slid an old photograph across the table. A woman around my age stood smiling beside Lake Michigan in a wool coat, dark hair blowing across her face. "Your mother," Eleanor said quietly, "your biological mother." I stared at the photograph so long my coffee went cold. "What was she like?" I whispered. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Brilliant, stubborn, too trusting of the wrong people." Some nights after those lunches, I drove home crying so hard I had to pull over near the lake. Grief is strange when you are mourning people you never truly got the chance to know. But slowly, almost invisibly, my life started expanding beyond survival. My essays turned into speaking invitations. Universities started contacting me about panels on identity and family systems. One podcast interview reached nearly 5 million listeners in 2 weeks. A literary agent emailed asking if I had ever considered writing a memoir. I almost deleted the message immediately out of instinct. Then, I remembered my mother's voice from years earlier. "Do not build your identity around temporary praise." For the first time in my life, I smiled at the memory instead of shrinking from it. A month later, I signed the contract. And the morning after the paperwork cleared, Eleanor called me unusually early. "Evelyn," she said gently, "there is something else you need to see. Something your mother fought very hard to keep hidden." 6 months after my birthday dinner collapsed in front of half of Chicago's upper social circle, I stood backstage at the Palmer House Hotel wearing a navy-tailored suit with a silver conference badge clipped beside my lapel that read Evelyn Reed Keynote Speaker. I kept staring at the badge while people rushed around adjusting microphones and lighting schedules, not because of the title. Because for the first time in my life, my name belonged entirely to me. A young assistant with a headset hurried toward me holding an iPad against her chest. "Miss Reed," they added 50 more chairs, she said breathlessly. "We are over capacity." "That is okay," I answered automatically. "People can stand in the back if they want." She laughed nervously. "Trust me, they will." The ballroom beyond the curtains buzzed with hundreds of voices layered together like static. Most of them were there because of my essays, some because of the scandal. Probably many for both. My publisher called it timing, trauma colliding with visibility. But standing backstage with polished heels pressing into thick hotel carpet, I understood something simpler. People listened when pain sounded honest. 5 minutes, the event coordinator whispered. I nodded and reached for my water bottle. My hands no longer shook before public appearances. That surprised me most. Somewhere between losing my family and rebuilding myself publicly, fear had stopped controlling every room I entered. Not confidence exactly, clarity. There is a difference. Earlier that morning, I caught my reflection in the hotel bathroom mirror while pinning my speaker badge onto my jacket. Calm expression. Hair pulled neatly back. Minimal makeup. Gold earrings Eleanor gave me for my first book signing. I looked composed in a way my younger self would never have believed possible. My mother used to say I carried myself like someone apologizing for taking up space. Now strangers stood in line for signed copies of my words. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the moderator stepped onto stage. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced warmly, please welcome best-selling author and cultural commentator Evelyn Reed. Applause hit like a wave, loud enough that I felt it in my chest before I fully processed the sound itself. I walked onto stage slowly beneath warm chandelier lighting while hundreds of faces turned toward me. Years ago, that amount of attention would have made me physically nauseous. Now I simply adjusted the microphone once and smiled gently at the audience. Thank you for being here tonight, I said. My voice sounded steady, controlled, mine. Somewhere near the third row, I noticed Eleanor watching proudly beside 2 publishing executives. She wore dark green silk and pearl earrings tonight. Elegant without trying. The closest thing to safety I had felt in a very long time. During the Q&A portion, a woman near the back stood holding the microphone with both hands. How did you survive becoming the villain in your own family's story? She asked softly. The room went completely still. Questions like that used to corner me emotionally. Now I let silence breathe for a second before answering. I stopped trying to earn love from people who only valued versions of me they could control. Pens started moving instantly across notebooks throughout the ballroom. I continued carefully, and I learned that being rejected by unhealthy systems is not always failure. Sometimes it is proof you finally stopped participating in your own erasure. Afterward, the signing line stretched nearly through the hotel lobby. A college student cried while handing me her copy. A middle-aged man quietly admitted he had not spoken to his father in 12 years because of similar family dynamics. A woman in scrubs said she listened to my audiobook during overnight hospital shifts because my voice made her feel less alone. Every conversation felt strangely sacred. Not because they admired me, because they trusted me with pieces of themselves. Near the end of the night, my publicist Dana approached holding her phone carefully. There is someone here asking for you privately, she said. I told security no interviews tonight. It is not press. Her expression shifted slightly. It is your brother. My stomach tightened immediately. Through the hotel lobby glass doors, I spotted Ethan standing near the valet entrance in a charcoal coat with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked older than I remembered. More tired around the eyes. For a second, neither of us moved. Then Dana touched my arm lightly. You do not have to do this if you are not ready. I stared at Ethan through the glass while snow drifted softly across Michigan Avenue behind him. No, I said quietly. I think maybe I am. Ethan looked nervous the second I stepped outside. He glanced briefly at the speaker badge still clipped to my jacket before meeting my eyes again. You did good in there, he said awkwardly. People were standing in the hallway. Why are you here? I asked. He swallowed once. Dad is sick. The city noise around us suddenly faded into something distant and hollow. Ethan looked down toward the snow, gathering along the curb before speaking again. And there are things about Mom you still do not know. The hospital smelled like coffee, antiseptic, and exhaustion. The kind of smell that settles into your clothes long after you leave. I stood near the elevators on the 7th floor, gripping a paper visitor badge between my fingers, while snow pressed softly against the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Ethan stood beside me with both hands shoved into his coat pockets. Neither of us had spoken much during the drive over. The silence between siblings feels different after betrayal. Familiar, but fragile. How bad is it? I finally asked. Ethan stared toward the nurse's station before answering. Heart failure complications. They caught pneumonia early, but... He stopped halfway through the sentence and rubbed his jaw tiredly. He looks older than he should. Something tightened painfully in my chest. My father had always seemed permanent to me growing up. Not warm exactly, but solid. The kind of man who wore wool coats in winter and smelled faintly like cedar and expensive aftershave. The kind of man who checked your tire pressure before snowstorms without mentioning it afterward. Seeing him inside a hospital bed felt impossible in a way I could not explain. Ethan glanced sideways at me. You do not have to stay long if you do not want to. Why did you really call me? He hesitated too long. Because Dad asked for you. That is not the only reason. His shoulders lowered slightly. No, he admitted quietly. It is not. A nurse rolled a medication cart past us, wheels squeaking softly against the tile floor. Somewhere down the hallway, a television played a game show too loudly inside another patient's room. Ordinary sounds. Strange how life keeps moving normally while entire families quietly fall apart behind closed doors. Mom is here too, Ethan said carefully. I looked at him immediately. Does she know I came? No. He exhaled slowly. Dad made me promise not to tell her. That answered more than he probably realized. My father had spent decades avoiding conflict with my mother. If he was hiding conversations from her now, something had changed. Ethan, I asked softly, what did you mean outside the hotel? About Mom? He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes briefly. I found documents. My stomach dropped immediately. What kind of documents? Hospital records. Legal correspondence. Old letters. He opened his eyes again. Eve, I do not think this started with an affair. The hallway suddenly felt colder. Then what did it start with? Ethan looked toward our father's room before answering. I think Dad has been protecting someone for a very long time. Before I could ask another question, the room door opened quietly. My mother stepped out holding a styrofoam coffee cup with both hands. She froze the second she saw me. Time seemed to stop around us. Even Ethan straightened beside me instinctively. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, her blonde hair now streaked heavily with silver near the temples, fine lines around her mouth deeper than before. Grief or stress or guilt, maybe all three, but her posture remained perfectly controlled. Margaret Carter could stand in the middle of emotional devastation and still look socially prepared for brunch. Evelyn, she said carefully, just my name. No accusation this time. No performance. I waited for anger to rise in me automatically the way it had for months. Instead, I mostly felt tired. How is he? I asked quietly. Her eyes flickered slightly at the question, like she had expected hostility instead of concern. Sleeping right now. She tightened her grip around the coffee cup. The doctors are optimistic, but he has been weaker lately. Ethan shifted awkwardly beside us. I am going to get coffee downstairs. Neither of us stopped him. The second he disappeared around the corner, silence settled heavily between my mother and me. We stood only a few feet apart, but it felt like years stretched between us. You look thin, she said eventually. I almost laughed because it was such a deeply maternal sentence coming from someone who had emotionally exiled me in public. You still do that, I replied softly. Do what? Talk around things instead of about them. She looked down at the coffee lid in her hands. Some conversations destroy people. Some lies do too. Her face tightened briefly. For a second, she looked genuinely hurt. Then the expression vanished again behind control. Your father wants to tell you everything, she said quietly. I do not know if that is wise. Wise for who? She did not answer. A doctor in blue scrubs passed us carrying a clipboard, nodding politely before disappearing into another room. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly. My mother suddenly looked exhausted in a way I had never allowed myself to notice before. Not weak, just worn down from holding too many secrets for too long. Did you ever love me? I asked, before I could stop myself. The question hung there between us so naked and childish that I instantly regretted saying it aloud. My mother looked stunned, truly stunned. Like after everything that had happened, that was somehow the question she least expected. Her eyes glistened slightly before she looked away toward the snow outside the hallway window. More than you understand, she whispered. Then she walked back into my father's hospital room without another word. I stood frozen outside the door with my heartbeat climbing higher and higher because for the first time since the ballroom, I realized something terrifying. Maybe my mother had not destroyed my life to hide shame. Maybe she had done it to hide someone else entirely. And inside that room, my father was finally ready to tell me who. I stood outside my father's hospital room for almost a full minute before touching the door handle. Through the narrow glass window, I could see him sitting upright against white pillows with reading glasses low on his nose and a hospital blanket folded across his lap. The heart monitor beside him beeped softly in steady rhythm. He looked smaller somehow, not weak exactly, just stripped down to the truth of being human. No tailored suits, no boardroom posture, no carefully managed image. Just an aging man sitting alone with consequences he could no longer outrun. He looked up the second I stepped inside. Relief crossed his face so quickly it hurt to witness. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. My throat tightened immediately at the familiar phrase. I closed the door quietly behind me and stayed near it for a second instead of walking fully inside. "Ethan said you wanted to talk." My father removed his glasses slowly. "I should have talked to you years ago." The room smelled faintly like antiseptic and stale coffee. Snow drifted outside the hospital windows beyond his bed in soft gray silence. I noticed a paperback novel resting upside down beside him, untouched. My father had always pretended to read when he was overwhelmed emotionally. "I do not even know where to start anymore," he admitted quietly. I finally moved closer and sat in the chair beside his bed. "Start with the truth." He stared at his hands for several seconds before speaking again. "Your biological mother was named Caroline Vale." The name settled into me strangely calmly. Eleanor had already prepared me for that part. "She was Eleanor's daughter," he continued, "and she was one of the kindest people I have ever known." His voice changed slightly when he talked about her. Softer, warmer, like memory itself hurt. "Did you love her?" I asked before I could stop myself. He closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Not hesitation, not guilt, just honesty. And somehow that honesty cut cleaner than every lie before it. "What about Mom?" I whispered. He leaned back carefully against the pillows. "Margaret and I were already married when Caroline came into our lives." My chest tightened immediately. "So there was an affair?" "No." His answer came fast, firm, not the way people would assume. He rubbed one hand slowly over his face. "Caroline was sick." I frowned. "Sick how?" He looked toward the window. "Leukemia." The word landed heavily in the quiet hospital room. Eleanor wanted Caroline treated privately because the Vale family lived under constant media attention back then. Your mother volunteered at Street Catherine's during fundraising events. That is how they met. My mind struggled to keep up with the timeline forming in front of me. "Caroline became pregnant during treatment," he continued softly. "The father disappeared before she even told him." "And you helped her?" He nodded slowly. "Your mother hated that." I stared at him. "Why?" He gave a tired laugh without humor. "Because Margaret spent years trying to have children before Ethan. Multiple miscarriages, fertility treatments, endless specialists." I blinked in shock. My mother never talked about any of that, ever. "When Caroline got worse during the pregnancy," he said carefully, "Margaret became involved in helping coordinate hospital care. At first I believed she was simply being compassionate." He paused there too long. "But?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Caroline died 3 days after you were born." Silence filled the room again, except for the soft beeping beside his bed. My biological mother was gone before she ever really got to hold me. The grief hit strangely delayed, like my body could only process one heartbreak at a time. "After the funeral," my father continued quietly, "Eleanor temporarily disappeared overseas, handling family matters. There were legal complications surrounding the Vale estate. Caroline had hidden parts of the pregnancy from almost everyone." He swallowed hard before continuing. "And while Eleanor was gone, Margaret made a decision." My stomach turned cold immediately. "What kind of decision?" He looked directly at me then, and I realized he had probably been carrying this guilt alone for decades. "She forged custody documentation." My breath caught. "What?" "Margaret convinced the hospital that Caroline wanted the baby placed privately." His voice sounded hoarse now. "By the time Eleanor returned, every legal trail had been manipulated. Birth records altered. Contact information erased." I stared at him in complete disbelief. "You are saying Mom stole me?" He looked shattered hearing the words spoken aloud. "At first I told myself she believed she was protecting you, protecting us. But over time..." He stopped. "Over time what?" His eyes filled slowly. "Over time I realized Margaret was terrified Eleanor would eventually come back for you." My entire body went numb. Suddenly, every strange tension in my childhood made horrifying sense. The distance, the control, the constant reminders about loyalty and gratitude. My mother had not been afraid of me embarrassing the family. She had been afraid I would discover I belonged to another one. "Dad," I whispered, barely able to breathe now. "Why did you stay silent?" His face crumpled completely then. "Because by the time I understood how far Margaret had gone," he said quietly, "you already called me Dad." Tears burned behind my eyes instantly. He reached toward the bedside drawer beside him with shaking fingers and pulled out an old photograph. A young woman stood smiling beside Lake Michigan holding a bundled newborn wrapped in a pale blanket. "Carolyn, me." Written across the bottom in faded blue ink were 4 words that made my entire chest ache. "For Richard, our little girl." The photograph stayed in my lap long after my father fell asleep. I sat beside the hospital bed listening to the soft rhythm of the heart monitor, while snow drifted outside the windows in slow gray silence. Caroline's smile in the picture looked familiar somehow, not because I remembered her, because I had seen pieces of that expression in my own reflection my entire life without understanding where it came from. For Richard. Our little girl. 4 simple words. Enough to destroy 28 years of confusion in one quiet moment. My father eventually opened his eyes again sometime after midnight. The room was dim except for the hallway light spilling softly beneath the door. "You should go home and sleep," he murmured. I looked up from the photograph. "I do not think I can sleep tonight." He nodded slightly like he understood. "Neither can I." There was no dramatic apology after that. No desperate speech asking for forgiveness. Just silence shared between 2 people who loved each other and had still somehow hurt each other deeply. Oddly enough, that honesty felt more comforting than anything else. Before leaving, I stood beside his bed and carefully placed the photograph back into his hands. "I do not know what happens now," I admitted quietly. My father looked at me for a long moment. "Neither do I." Then after a pause he added softly, "But whatever name you choose, whatever family you claim, you were still the best thing that ever happened to me." I looked away immediately because tears had already started burning behind my eyes again. Outside the room, my mother sat alone near the hallway windows with untouched coffee beside her and her coat folded neatly across her lap. She looked up the second she saw me. Neither of us spoke right away. The hospital at night felt strangely suspended from the rest of the world. Quiet wheels rolling across tile floors. Distant intercom announcements. Nurses speaking softly near supply carts. "How much did he tell you?" she finally asked. I stood across from her with my purse still hanging from one shoulder. "Enough." She closed her eyes briefly. "Then you know it was complicated." "No," I answered calmly. "It was cruel." The words landed between us quietly. My mother did not argue immediately. That surprised me. She just stared down at her, hands folded tightly together in her lap. For the first time in my life, Margaret Carter looked like someone carrying shame instead of authority. "I loved you," she whispered after a long silence. "You controlled me," I replied gently. "That is not the same thing." Her face tightened slightly like she wanted to defend herself, but no defense came. "You have to understand what state I was in back then," she said quietly. "After the miscarriages, after years of feeling broken." She stopped and looked toward the hospital room behind me. "Then suddenly there was this baby, this beautiful little girl who needed someone. So, you decided I belonged to you. I believed I could give you stability." I let out a slow breath. "You spent 28 years making sure I never felt secure enough to leave you emotionally." That finally made her flinch. Not loudly, just a tiny crack in composure. "That was never my intention. Maybe not consciously." My voice stayed calm, almost tired. "But every time I succeeded, you pulled away. Every time I became more independent, you treated me like a threat." Tears gathered in her eyes now, though she still held herself rigidly upright. "You looked so much like Caroline as you got older," she admitted softly. People started noticing. The confession settled over me heavily, all those years of distance. The criticism, the coldness after my writing career began growing publicly. She had not just feared abandonment, she had feared exposure. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" I asked. She looked out toward the snow-covered city lights beyond the glass. "I told myself I would when the timing was safer." "Safer for who?" Her silence answered everything. A nurse walked past us, carrying fresh linens, smiling politely before disappearing around the corner. Life continuing around grief again. It always amazed me how ordinary the world remained during personal devastation. My mother reached into her purse slowly, and pulled out a folded envelope. "Eleanor gave this back to me years ago," she said quietly. "I kept it hidden." I hesitated before taking it from her. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 28 years earlier. Caroline's handwriting curved softly across faded paper. "If anything happens to me, please tell my daughter someday that none of this was her fault." I read the sentence twice because suddenly I could not breathe properly. My mother looked away while I held the letter carefully in trembling hands. "I could not bear losing you," she whispered. "So instead you made sure I never fully belonged anywhere." Tears slid silently down her face now. Real ones, not performance, not manipulation, just grief arriving too late to undo damage. I folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. "I am not punishing you by setting boundaries," I said softly. "I am protecting the version of myself I had to build without you." My mother's shoulders shook once beneath her coat. "Will you ever come home again?" The question hung between us painfully, because I realized then she still thought home meant the same thing to both of us. I looked toward my father's hospital room one last time before answering. "I think I am still figuring out where home actually is." Then I walked toward the elevators while my mother remained alone beside the window, holding Caroline's letter in both hands like it was the first honest thing she had touched in years. Almost a year after the hospital conversation, I stood barefoot in a small white house overlooking Lake Michigan, while early morning sunlight spilled across hardwood floors, still smelling faintly like fresh paint. The house was not enormous, no marble staircase, no gated driveway, no ballroom large enough to humiliate someone publicly. Just quiet rooms, soft gray walls, shelves full of books, and windows wide enough to let the lake light pour in every morning. Eleanor helped me find it after my memoir release tour ended. "A home should feel peaceful in your nervous system," she told me while we signed paperwork at the closing office. "Not impressive to strangers." I think about that sentence often now. My father recovered slowly after the hospital stay. We never became magically healed overnight the way movies pretend families do after secrets come out. Some damage changes shape but never disappears completely. Still, every Sunday afternoon he calls me around 3 o'clock, just to ask what I am cooking for dinner or whether the lake wind is bad near the house. Sometimes we sit together quietly on my back porch, drinking coffee without forcing conversations neither of us knows how to have yet. Healing, I learned, is often less dramatic than people expect. Sometimes it is simply consistency after years of fear. My mother and I speak rarely. Birthdays, holidays, brief messages during storms when she worries about driving conditions, even though she still struggles to say the words "I am sorry" directly. But I stopped needing her apology to move forward. That changed everything. Because there is a strange freedom that arrives when you finally understand someone can love you imperfectly and still never be safe enough to hand your self-worth to. Ethan visits sometimes too, usually carrying overpriced pastries and awkward guilt he still has not fully unpacked. Last month he stood in my kitchen watching me prepare soup while snow fell outside and suddenly said, "You know, Mom used to read all your articles in secret." I looked up from the cutting board. "What?" He nodded once. "She printed them out. Highlighted sections. Dad found stacks of them in her office after the hospital." The image hurt in ways I did not expect. My mother hiding my words inside drawers she could not publicly praise. Loving me in secret while fearing me in public. Human beings are complicated like that. Sometimes the people who wound us most deeply are also the people most wounded themselves. That truth does not excuse what they did, but understanding it can stop the pain from poisoning your future. My memoir eventually spent 14 weeks on the bestseller list. Universities invited me to speak about identity, emotional survival, and inherited shame. Thousands of people wrote letters telling me pieces of their own family stories. A woman from Texas mailed me a photograph of herself standing outside her first apartment after leaving an abusive household. A man in Oregon sent a handwritten note saying he finally started therapy at 52 because my story made him realize silence was not strength. Every letter reminded me that pain shared honestly has a strange ability to become light for someone else. Some nights I still sit awake wondering who I might have become if the truth had arrived earlier, if Caroline had lived, if Margaret had chosen honesty instead of fear. But then I look around this quiet little house by the lake and realize something important. The version of me standing here now exists because I finally stopped abandoning myself to earn love from people unable to give it safely. That was the real inheritance hidden beneath all the lies. Not money, not family names, self-respect, boundaries, freedom. If you are listening to my story tonight while sitting in a room where you feel unseen, unwanted, controlled, or emotionally exhausted by people who claim to love you, I need you to hear this gently. Your worth does not decrease because someone failed to recognize it properly. Some families confuse control with protection. Some parents confuse sacrifice with ownership. And some people will spend years trying to convince you that staying small is loyalty. It is not. Protect your finances. Protect your peace. Listen when your body tells you something feels wrong long before your mind can explain it clearly. God, or the universe, or whatever name you give to that quiet inner knowing inside yourself, often whispers the truth long before life forces you to confront it loudly. Trust that voice. It may save you years of shrinking yourself to survive environments that were never healthy to begin with. My name is Evelyn Reed. I am 29 years old now, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. The people who failed to love you correctly should never become the voice that defines your value. Tonight before bed, I placed Caroline's photograph into a simple silver frame beside my living room window. In the picture, she is smiling into the lake wind while holding me wrapped in that tiny hospital blanket. Beside the frame sits the old pearl bracelet my mother once gave me for my 16th birthday. Two women. Two different kinds of love. Both part of me now. Outside the window, the lake moved quietly beneath winter moonlight while the house settled gently around me with soft wooden creaks that sounded almost like breathing. And for the first time in my life, home no longer felt like something I had to earn. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you want to walk beside more stories about healing, betrayal, quiet strength, and rebuilding life after emotional heartbreak, there are more waiting for you in the next videos and playlists on this channel. Some of them may feel painfully familiar. Some may help you understand parts of your own story you have never said out loud before. And maybe, somewhere inside the next story, you will finally recognize pieces of yourself that deserve to be loved more gently too.